General Hospital spoilers reveal that no one in Port Charles was prepared for the truth that had been festering beneath the chaos, a truth so violently stitched into the shadows that the moment it finally surfaced, it threatened to tear apart every fragile alliance holding the town together. For months, everyone believed the man collapsing in the hospital, the man whose mind unraveled after a single syringe. The man Willow thought she nearly killed was Drew. They mourned his rapid decline. They whispered fears about his erratic behavior. They wondered if prison had broken him beyond repair. But the hollow truth was far worse. That man was never Drew at all. He was a creation. A precision-made imitation conjured from the twisted remnants of technology. Faison left behind technology that should have died with him, but instead found a new master in Sidwell. The clone, engineered to mimic Drew's memories and emotional patterns, had been slowly deteriorating from the moment it entered Port Charles. The poisoning only accelerated the collapse, revealing fractures no one knew to look for. And while the town agonized over a dying man, the real Drew was fighting for his life in a hidden facility far from any map, far from any rescue. For months, Drew had been nothing but a vessel to those who imprisoned him, a body to harvest, a neural pattern to replicate, a weaponized blueprint meant to serve a larger, colder plan. His memories were extracted, analyzed, and implanted into the clone in fragments, leaving Drew disoriented, weakened, but not defeated. In the sterile darkness of his cell, Drew learned to survive the way only a man who had lost everything can. He memorized patterns, counted footsteps, studied shifts in guard behavior, and waited. The day the power flickered, even for a second, Drew seized it, slipping through a doorway before the locks re-engaged, fighting through alarms, still half-powered, forcing his battered body through corridors where he once lay strapped to machines. His escape was not clean. It was not elegant, but it was real. And for the first time in months, Drew could breathe open air, even if that air tasted of fear and blood and the realization that nothing he returned to would be the same. Meanwhile, Sidwell watched the chaos brewing with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable. The clone had done exactly what he intended, created instability, forced alliances to crumble, made Willow vulnerable. Drew's collapse shifted power dynamics across Port Charles, leaving Sonny's faction distracted. Jason's investigation tangled in shadows, and Anna's rescue exposing fractures within WSB that hadn't fully healed. Sidwell didn't care who broke under the weight of his schemes. The clone was always meant to be disposable. A tool, a distraction, a Trojan horse wearing Drew's face. But what Sidwell did not anticipate was that the clone's deterioration would accelerate beyond his calculations. The neurological decay resembled madness, emotional imbalance spiraling into violence, and now, as doctors attempted to stabilize him, the clone's brain was beginning to collapse in ways that mirrored the breakdown of Faison's earlier experiments. If the clone regained even a flash of awareness before it died, it could expose everything, every lab, every experiment, every secret Sidwell had buried. And that risk was unacceptable. As Drew journeyed back toward Port Charles, the emotional fallout spread like wildfire. Willow found herself unable to process the quiet terror creeping into her thoughts, the wrongness she felt every time she replayed the moment she injected the man she believed was her husband. Something in his eyes had been off cold, detached, almost mechanical. She tried to dismiss it as guilt distorting her memory, but deep down she sensed the truth inching closer, like a whisper she could not yet hear. Michael watched her unravel, unaware that the foundation of her life was built on a lie engineered by men far beyond their comprehension. Carly, already thrown off balance by her own battles, sensed something deeper happening, but couldn't yet name the storm forming at the edges. Jason, however, felt it. He always did. The more he dug into Britt's confession, the more the shadows around Port Charles rearranged themselves into a pattern. He recognized a pattern that always pointed to something bigger, something hidden, something engineered. When Drew finally staggered into the outskirts of Port Charles, exhausted, bruised, half-starved, the town was on the brink of a revelation it wasn't prepared for. The moment Drew attempted to contact anyone, confusion ignited instantly. How could Drew be alive and coherent while another Drew lay dying in the hospital? How could two identical men exist with overlapping memories, overlapping identities, overlapping timelines that made no sense? Jason was the first to understand. One look at the real Drew's eyes, scarred but grounded, broken but present, and Jason knew. The man in the hospital was a lie. A manufactured ghost wearing another man's life. But understanding did not prevent the nightmare from unfolding. The clone, deteriorating faster than expected, began seizing, thrashing, speaking in fragments taken from Drew's stolen memories, broken pieces that no longer fit together. And as the town gathered around his failing body, the truth spilled out in horrifying bursts. Words that didn't belong to him. Memories that contradicted themselves. A final, desperate question whispered through trembling lips. Where am I supposed to go if I'm not him? Then came the collapse. Machines screamed. Doctors rushed. And the moment the clone's heart stopped, every screen in the hospital flickered, a remote signal triggered by Sidwell. A warning. A threat. A declaration that the game had only just begun. Drew's return didn't bring peace. It brought the beginning of a war none of them understood. Because now Port Charles had to face a truth more terrifying than death. If Sidwell could replace Drew once, he could do it again. He could do it to anyone. No identity was safe. No memory was secure. No life was untouchable. And the real Drew standing on borrowed strength was no longer returning home. He was walking back into a battlefield that now existed because of his stolen face. Drew was slipping further into a terrifying silence. A silence that felt less like unconsciousness and more like imprisonment inside his own failing body. As if every attempt to speak, to reach out, to reclaim himself was swallowed by a void that tightened around him with each passing hour. Doctors warned that he might lose all communicative function indefinitely, that even if he eventually recovered, the journey back would be long fractured and uncertain. But no one in Port Charles understood the darkest truth that the man lying motionless on the hospital bed might not be Drew at all, but a carefully engineered imitation whose collapse was never a tragic accident, but a predictable outcome of the grotesque science used to create him. And while Willow stood helpless beside the bed, drowning in guilt for believing she had caused Drew's decline, the true horror was beginning to take shape far away from the hospital, where the real Drew was forcing his broken body through narrow corridors of the underground facility he had been, trapped in for months. His memories came in flashes, fragments of faces, scattered images of Scout. The sound of Willow's laugh, but none of it was whole enough to anchor him. He knew only one thing with certainty: he had been replaced. And the thing that replaced him had been designed to die once. Its purpose was fulfilled. Sidwell had orchestrated everything with chilling precision, weaving the threads of Faison's abandoned cloning technology with his own agenda. The dying imitation in the hospital was nothing more than a prototype, a disposable version meant to destabilize alliances and manipulate emotional vulnerabilities. Sidwell was not interested in Drew as a person. He was interested in what Drew represented: military insight, access to Sonny's network emotional leverage through Willow, and the psychological fallout that would ripple outward once the truth began to crack open. But Sidwell's plan had one flaw: he underestimated the resilience of the original. The real Drew had endured months of experimentation, torture disguised as research, memory extraction that left him gasping for identity. And yet he survived long enough to exploit a weakness in the facility's security. His escape was not triumphant. It was desperate, messy, and incomplete. His body weak and trembling as he climbed through ventilation shafts and sprinted barefoot into the night. But it was real, and with every painful step, Drew felt a fire building inside him, a need to reclaim the life stolen from him and expose everything Sidwell had done. Back in Port Charles, Willow began noticing details she had ignored before. The man she believed was Drew did not react to her the same way he once had. He did not remember certain phrases that had meaning only between them. He did not carry himself with Drew's quiet strength, nor did he soften at the mention of Scout the way Drew always had. These inconsistencies festered in her mind, each one unraveling another thread in the illusion she had accepted as truth. And while she struggled to make sense of the guilt haunting her after injecting him, she could not escape the feeling that she did not break Drew. She broke something pretending to be him. The terror of that possibility crept into her bones, but before she could confront it, the clone's condition worsened, triggering neurological responses no human body should ever exhibit. Words spilled from his lips, fragmented, overlapping, contradicting themselves, echoes of memories stolen from a man who wasn't there. And as Willow listened, she felt something inside her fracture. Meanwhile, Jason, already investigating the shadows surrounding Britt's forced involvement in Faison's last project, began connecting dots that others had missed. The surveillance patterns, the timing of Drew's behavioral shift after Pentonville, the quiet but deliberate movements from Sidwell's circle, none of it aligned with an ordinary medical crisis. Jason followed the trail like a hunter tracking a silent predator, and the deeper he went, the more he realized that the threat wasn't just aimed at Drew. It was aimed at Port Charles itself. If Sidwell could replace Drew once, he could replace anyone, Sonny, Anna, even Jason. Identity was no longer a certainty. It was a weapon. Drew's return, when it finally happened, would not bring relief. It would bring chaos. His memories were compromised, his body fragile, and his truth so violent that no one could absorb it without shattering. When he stepped back into the world he had been stolen from, he would force every person he loved to confront a nightmare they never considered possible, that they had poured their trust, their grief, their love into a stranger wearing his face. Willow would break, Scout would be thrust into confusion, Jason would prepare for war. Sonny, already surrounded by enemies, would realize the battlefield had expanded into territory he never expected: biological warfare, identity theft, psychological sabotage. But the worst part of all, the part that would turn Port Charles into a ticking time bomb, was the possibility Sidwell had engineered another version of Drew, a more stable, more obedient, more dangerous model waiting to be activated. The dying clone in the hospital was not the end of Sidwell's project. It was merely the beginning. And once the real Drew stepped forward, once his voice finally returned, and he began revealing the torments and experiments he endured, Sidwell would not retreat. He would escalate. He would unleash the next phase, and Port Charles, already stretched thin by kidnappings, betrayals, and conspiracies, would find itself staring into a darkness that did not just threaten lives, but identities themselves. Drew's struggle to reclaim his life was no longer just a personal battle. It was a war against a system built to erase him. And when he finally reached a city he once called home, he would not return as a survivor. He would return as a spark, and the explosion that followed would change everything. Drew had reached the point where the boundaries between physical imprisonment and mental confinement began to blur. A point where, even after escaping the facility that held him, he remained trapped inside the invisible cage built from trauma-fragmented memories, and the lingering influence of the experiments forced upon him. His mind had learned to shut down as a survival instinct, folding inward to protect itself from the invasive procedures, the neurological manipulations, and the conditioning protocols that turned every thought into a battlefield. Now, even as he moved freely through the shadows of Port Charles, Drew carried the suffocating sensation of being locked in a room without walls, a psychological prison that threatened to swallow him whole unless he forced himself out of it. This internal struggle became the catalyst for a profound shift, because to reclaim his life, Drew first had to break out of the mental state his captors had engineered. The moment he recognized this, something inside him cracked open, not in collapse but in awakening. He felt the stirring of defiance, the faint pulse of the man he used to be, rising from the rubble of a consciousness designed to suppress him. And that shift, that internal rebellion, triggered the beginning of a transformation that would soon alter everything around him. As Drew fought to escape the psychological restraints, the world outside continued spiraling into danger. Sidwell's calculations were unraveling faster than predicted. The failing clone in the hospital, exhibiting unpredictable neurological distortions, sent up warning signals that the project was collapsing. The data imprints uploaded into the clone's mind were unstable, the neural graphs degrading, causing a flood of corrupted memories to leak in fragments that no longer aligned. Sidwell recognized this as a threat not because the clone would survive, but because the clone's deterioration might reveal secrets Drew was never supposed to speak. He knew that if Drew truly broke through his internal confinement, the balance of power would shift instantly, and every lie constructed by his operation would face exposure. Thus, Sidwell prepared contingency plans that involved a second wave of aggression, a targeted strike designed to cripple Drew emotionally and physically before he regained full control of his identity. But what Sidwell failed to anticipate was how profoundly the internal confrontation reshaped Drew's perception. Once Drew began clawing his way out of the mental lockdown, clarity returned, not in clean fragments but in violent bursts, flashes of images, sensations of pain. Voices of his captors overlapping with memories of Scout and Willow and the life he lost. These flashes didn't weaken him, they fueled him. They reawakened the instincts that long ago made him a survivor. And as these instincts flooded back, Drew realized something chilling. He was not simply running from the people who imprisoned him. He was preparing to strike back. Sidwell's system was built on the assumption that Drew would emerge broken submissive, too mentally fractured to launch a counterattack. But Drew was no longer the compliant subject they molded in the lab. He was becoming something far more dangerous, a man forged by pain, sharpened by betrayal, and fueled by the primal need to reclaim what was stolen. That awakening triggered another major shift in Port Charles. Energetically, the city began vibrating with the sense of something approaching, something coming for them before they even knew to fear it. Jason felt it first, a tension in the air that mirrored the calm before a storm. Willow sensed it too, not through logic, but through instinct, the sensation that some unseen force was moving toward her, toward the truth, toward the shattering of everything she believed about Drew. Sonny, embroiled in his own war with Cullum and Sidwell's associates, recognized the pattern of a new threat rising from the deep. Everyone felt the disturbance even before they understood its source. Drew was no longer just a missing man, or a victim. He was becoming a counterforce, an unpredictable variable Sidwell could no longer control. And then came the first strike, Drew's attempt to reclaim the power that had been drained from him for months. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't elegant. It was raw, instinctive, and explosive. A surge of adrenaline hit him as he confronted the remnants of the mental scripts implanted into him. For the first time since his imprisonment, Drew attacked not physically but mentally, breaking the conditioning. Rejecting the false memories, tearing apart the psychological chains meant to keep him compliant. The wave of rebellion inside him radiated outward like shockwaves, driving him toward the inevitable collision with Sidwell's forces. With each breath, Drew stepped further into the version of himself he had been denied. His body was weak, but his resolve was volcanic. and resolve was more dangerous than strength. That moment, Drew's full escape from the mental prison was the spark that ignited the next phase of the crisis. Sidwell detected the shift through biometric markers they had implanted long ago. Data spikes, neural rejection, behavioral deviation, all signs that Drew had broken conditioning. And in response, Sidwell activated the next plan, a direct attack aimed at stopping Drew before he regained enough strength to expose. The lab, the experiments, the clone program, and the network built behind the scenes. Sidwell's order was clear: neutralize Drew before he rises. But Drew was already rising, and his counterattack had only just begun.